Hey, welcome to Season 6 of the Two Text Podcast. I'm here with my co-host David Harvey, and my name is John Andrews. So this is a podcast of two friends from two different countries meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads to us talking about two texts and often many more. Now this season we're exploring Jesus' I am sayings in John's Gospel and how they draw us into a bigger vision of who Jesus is.
Well, John, if we're going to talk about the I am sayings in John's Gospel, we probably need to spend a little bit of time thinking about the fact that they are in John's Gospel. So if we kind of just parachute our way in and say, let's take a handful of sayings, a big handful of sayings, admittedly, about Jesus' use of I am, I think it helps maybe for us to see that this is not just us projecting a notion onto John's Gospel, but actually that John seems to want us to see things like this. And I think that's even hinted at right from, I think I'm going to say, the very first word of John's Gospel, that he's drawing us to see something about Jesus that he doesn't want us to miss, that the I am saying show us, but actually I think he's always trying to show us. Would you say that's a...
Yeah, absolutely. I'd go totally with that. I think it's because these I am sayings are classic, aren't they? You know, if you've been around the church any length of time, and even if you've bounced around on the fringe of the church, you've probably heard or seen somewhere an I am, especially the more famous ones. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. These sorts of statements bounce around. And of course, they are so magnificent that the danger is they become vacuumized. We sort of disconnect them from the flow of John's overall argument. And what's quite striking, which we'll see, of course, as we get to it, is that some of the I am sayings have an extra dimension to them because you simply read them in the flow of John's argument, the flow of John's developing narrative. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we set the I ams, not just the big seven in a sense that sometimes we've referred to, but we've already referred to these lovely soft I ams, these almost hidden I ams within the text, another 7 of them. So if you took those together with the big I ams, we've got 14 references to an I am statement from Jesus. John is clearly wanting us to pick up those breadcrumbs. And I think sort of understanding where John's going and seeing the introduction of John's Gospel, I think is a way of starting to read those ideas and contextualize them.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting, something I think you and I said on the podcast some time ago, so probably well before the Acts podcast, so it maybe bears repeating. There almost feels like with John's Gospel, the way to understand it is as best as you can to almost memorize his introduction. It feels like at almost any point of the gospel, he's going to write something, and he sort of writes it from the perspective that you remember how this thing started, and that you can sort of hold that in your memory because that's going to help you. So we come and say the I am statements are echoing the name of God in the Old Testament. And you think, well, are we really going to believe that that's what John is showing us about Jesus in just a phrase like I am? But then when you see how he begins this gospel of drawing us right into the language of the creation story and the things he says about Jesus, it starts to sound far less out there and far more normal and expected. So we're going to read the prologue of John's Gospel, aren't you? And
I am. I have the privilege of reading this magnificent bit of scripture. In our Bible, it's the first 18 verses of John's Gospel. And I'll read from the NIV version, which is still beautiful in regard to this. Make some changes on the way, but there we are. So it reads like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome or even comprehended it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling or tented among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." Wow. There we go. You can unfasten your seatbelts now, everyone.
It's quite the text, isn't it? It's quite the text.
It's magnificent.
And so, I mean, goodness, where do we even start with this? Like, do we go right back to the beginning of the text? And I mean, at some level, I think we become maybe a little deaf to this in the contemporary context, but John starts his gospel in Greek with exactly the same word sequence as Genesis begins in Greek, right? And I think even in English you can hear that, in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is a stunning start. I'm trying to think of a way that is modern. You know, I think about what draws me to mind, John, is I remember in my early 20s, would it be? No, actually, probably even late teens now, I think of it, you know, going to the movie theater and sitting down and the prequel, the first of the Star Wars prequels was coming out. You know, and I was born of the era that, you know, Star Wars was the movie that you grew up watching. Yeah. And I remember the screen going dark and that blue writing coming up, you know, coming up the screen. The yellow writing started coming a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Far away.
And the moment you see those words, you know the story that you're in, right? Like instantly you're drawn back into the story. In fact, even just seeing those letters scroll in that particular way up the screen, you know what story you're in. And I think, and even that's not as significant as example as a Jewish writer beginning a story in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
That, do you think I'm over-egging that?
Oh, no, absolutely not. I mean, I think John is gloriously, unashamedly linking the beginning of the gospel of Jesus to the beginning of the Torah and the beginning of creation, and linking those. And I think we're meant to hear that. In fact, I love John's sort of repeat of the idea. He starts with in the beginning, and then at the end of sort of his second major phrase in verse 2, he finishes with it within the beginning. So he's double emphasizing the beginning. He wants us to absolutely know that actually there can be no missing the point I want to make here. That the beginning that the Torah speaks of in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, is now the beginning that I'm speaking of. And this word person is absolutely at the heart of that beginning moment. And we cannot now think of the beginning as we understand it. In Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now that glorious, in Hebrew, 7-word opening statement of the Torah is now reimagined through John 1, verse 1 and verse 2. We're now reading Genesis 1:1 and John differently because of John 1:1, essentially. And I think John is doing something absolutely magnificent within that. The Word was there in the beginning. He was with God. He was God. And we're absolutely introduced to this person. Now, it'll take a few verses before we discover who that person is being named by John in the prologue. But we're suddenly introduced in the same way we're dramatically introduced in the third word of the text to God in Genesis. Bereshit bara Elohim, it begins. So beautifully within that text. We're introduced to this word person, in the beginning was the word. And if I can remember it in Greek, anarchen hologos, I think is the Greek, if I quoted that properly from memory.
Yes.
That's a risky thing to do in the podcast when I haven't got the Greek text to hand.
Yeah, yes, but in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I mean, it's a beautiful, and of course, notice the three things he says. There's almost this, I mean, this is me just projecting, but there's almost this Trinitarian nature to it. It was, beginning, so with time, presence, he was with God, and identity, he was God. And again, even that is undoubtedly accidentally heretical to even narrow Jesus down into those sort of categories. So, I mean, there's a lot to say about this, and I don't want to cut it short, but I just wanted to hold then, if our listener then remembers, so the first verse is, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But then just listen to this, to the final verse of the prologue then. Right? Yeah. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known, right? And so you've got this stunning sense of, in one sense, the big vision of the God, the Creator, the Genesis story, the origins of all creation happening. And then a really controversial statement in a Jewish context of one says, yes, no one has ever seen God, but now there is one who is making God known. And I think this is really interesting in terms of some of the arguments that you see unfold in Romans. But I think it's even interesting in terms of some of the arguments that unfold in John's gospel, right? Yeah. So like John uses a really interesting word here where we translate it "made him known." The Greek word is exegeomai, right? Which is where we get the word, the biblical scholars get the word exegete from. And to exegete the text is to go to the text of Scripture and get out of it its meaning, right? And so think about John's using this term as almost, you could translate it, it is God, the only Son, who's close to the Father's heart, who has interpreted him, right? Who has explained him, who has made him able to be understood. Not Moses, which will become a huge narrative within, I think, not the Torah, which is, again, another sort of huge narrative. And if I can sound like Karl Barth for a second, not even creation. Yeah. So, and I don't wish to cause like huge problems for people, but it's amazing how often we say things in our lives that I think we almost put equal to Jesus. So, so for example, as somebody that loves being in the mountains, I might sit at the top of a mountain and I might say, oh my goodness, sitting at the mountains brings me closer to Jesus, right? Brings me closer to God. And I've met people who are like, oh, I felt like being in the mountains brought me to believing in God.
Yeah.
And I understand what we're saying when we say this. So please don't anyone hear me criticizing that sense and the emotion of that and even the spirituality of that. But what John's wanting to do is actually draw us deeper than that and say those are spiritual moments. Those are spiritual experiences. But the only way that you actually find God is because Christ made him known, right?
Yes.
And so actually these are experiences. What Christ is drawing us to is a knowing. So there's this fascinating sort of arc in this prologue. In the beginning was the Word, but John is not positing some sort of creational theology that says, oh, if you spend enough time in the forest, you'll eventually find God, right?
Yeah.
He's not saying, oh, this sounds like the Old Testament. If you spend enough time in Scripture, you'll eventually find God, right? And that even sounds controversial to say. He's leading us to the point of, I believe anyway, he's leading us to the point of the encounter with Christ is the thing that changes. It's only Christ. So have you met Jesus on a long walk in the forest? Possibly, because Christ has made himself known in these spaces, right? Have you met Jesus in a long read of the Scripture? Quite possibly, because Christ has made himself known. But I think John wants us to know if Christ doesn't make himself known, if he doesn't do the exegeting, we're not stumbling over Jesus in a forest. We're not stumbling over Jesus even reading the law or having a conversation with Moses. Now, that might be too heavy right away, John, but did you hear what I'm sort of pushing at there? Maybe help me kind of land it a little better.
No, I think you landed that perfectly, and I think that leads us beautifully into the I am conversations. If the conclusion of John's prologue is that the person that he's now presenting is making the Father known, then how does he do that? And so we get Jesus all the way through the Gospel of John making him known, and he's making him known through his own life and ministry. But of course, then when we come to reflect on these dynamic I am statements, that's got to be part of that conversation. Something that Jesus is saying is revealing the heart of the Father. Something that Jesus is saying is because, to quote the text, he is in the bosom of the Father, as it were. So you're getting this beautiful sense that the person introduced to us is introduced to us in a creational context, but he comes to us in a redemptive context. He's coming to us now to reveal the heart and person of the Lord, so that actually men and women, boys and girls, can encounter him and see him. I love what John says slightly earlier on. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So there is a beholding, there is a seeing, there is a revelation. And John seems to be making it clear that the key to that revelation is Jesus himself. Right at the end of his book, he writes, I write these things so that you will know and by implication understand and see that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and that in believing in these things, you will have life in his name. So topping and tailing the book is definitely the idea that Jesus is this, not only this glorious part of the Godhead, but Jesus is come to reveal the very nature and heart of God on earth. So I don't think you're over pushing it at all. I think that's from verse 18, we are now launched on a trajectory of discovery, and we're supposed to be reading everything in John with this view. That he's revealing the heart of the Father, that he is revealing God, that he is come to open our eyes so that we would see him, and that so that not just admire him and the stars and the moon and the sun, which is magnificent, but actually understand, there is a person at the heart of this, and it's seeing him that changes everything. I've been to the Rockies close to where you live, and you stand in the Rockies and you go, "Oh my goodness, this is just breathtaking." But you can look at the Rockies and believe a whole heap of things, and not actually be led to a revelation that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the Son of a living God, which is the key thing for the salvation of our own world.
Yes. And that's the point. I think it's such a good point for us to make sure we always grasp is that, and it sounds controversial almost to say at first until you really think about it. But essentially what John's pointing out to us is nobody is finding Jesus by themselves. Nobody is finding God by themselves. So whatever you're going to encounter in John's gospel is not some sort of spiritual formation progression plan that you can read this, work out how to make your own way to God, right? The only one who has seen God is this Son, and he is making him known to us. And I mean, think about this. We're two guys that have just spent a lot of time in Acts, and we love Luke. It's so beautifully aligned with what we see throughout Luke's gospel as well.
Yeah,
the Father is the one coming to us. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are coming to us. The Trinity is absolutely set on finding lost humanity. And so here we see John just dropping perfectly into that agenda and being like, yep, no, if you are here, it's because Christ has looked for you. It's because Christ has made it clear to you. It's because Christ has explained it to you. And you're going to see that unfold throughout John's gospel, is that time and time again, John's going to show you humans utterly missing the point, right?
Yeah.
Like I was just reading John 11 the other day there, and it made me laugh. I was reading it out loud to some friends, and I was laughing at the moment where John's almost gone out of his way to point out humans really do miss the point. And Jesus says, right, okay, we have to go to Judea because our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. And the disciples say, oh, well, if he's fallen asleep, he'll be fine. And then it says, so Jesus said plainly, Lazarus is dead. And it made me laugh, John, because it's just like, these disciples can't get anything right, unless Jesus explains it to them. But think about that. That statement there in John 11 is absolutely an unpacking of John 18. The humans don't know what's going on unless Jesus says it plainly to them, and just Jesus exegetes it. He makes it known. So this is going to be like this beautiful bookend, and all we've talked about is the two verses so far. In the beginning was the Word. So the scriptural testimony is true, right?
Yeah.
What the Bible has told us about God is true, but now it's becoming made known to us by God Himself in His Son. It's a stunning turnaround, and unexpected turnaround, I would imagine.
Yeah, completely. And of course, thinking about the audience that John is writing to, he's writing not only to people who will believe, but he's anticipating that his work will be read maybe by a wider audience of both Jewish and Gentile people.
Yes.
And again, for a Jewish worldview, that is a challenge. For a Gentile worldview, it's also a challenge. So John is bringing a challenge to both worldviews, that actually the one that he is presenting is not only at the heart of creation, not only was he at the heart of the Hebrew Bible, but he is at the heart of the redemption process. And in fact, he has come to us. He has entered into humanity in order to save us. And I do love that. And I know we'll do a sort of a bit more of a deep dive in terms of the introduction, but I love the fact that even the way John writes his prologue in terms of repeat words, repeat ideas, it's very similar to Genesis 1, where lots of ideas get rhythmically, poetically, beautifully repeated over and over again. I did a wee check. God gets mentioned 8 times in that prologue. Made or came into being, that sort of idea phrase 7 times. Light gets mentioned 7 times. The word gets mentioned 4 times. World 4 times. Witness 4 times. Darkness 2 times. Father 2 times, grace and truth 2 times. So you're getting lovely I love the sort of, it's the I mean, it's magnificent theology, but it's written in a almost a similar style to Genesis 1 as well, in terms of
Yes.
that gorgeous, rhythmic, poetic, repeat, draw in sense of reading that. And John's just repeating some of these great ideas, which of course, in the context of the gospel itself, he will come back to over and over and over again. And in some of those I ams, we can't read the I ams without hearing the echo of the prologue. So I mean, I love what he does. And in terms of that playfulness within the text, but of course that playfulness leads us to some profound ideas that are resident within that text that we've already alluded to.
And look at this. Let's go back up to the top then, and let me just read what you read to us. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. I love that. I love that little phrase there. The darkness did not grasp it, could not hold it, is almost the language there. Now, I would say it like this: in the same way as the people respond to Jesus saying later in John's gospel, before Abraham was, I am. They respond with that, with an accusation of blasphemy by saying, I am, you have made yourself to be God. I don't know that there's any way to read this opening prologue without feeling the blasphemous, like as a Jewish writer, thinking in, to hear a phrase like all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being, and he brought life and light. I think you can read that in the synagogue with absolutely no controversy whatsoever until you say, we're talking about Jesus.
That's right.
we're talking about that guy that was over there. I mean, I don't think I'm underplaying how blasphemous a statement like this would sound in that original context. Do you think?
Yeah. I would totally agree. And I think, again, the uncompromising way the Torah begins, where it's not up for discussion. It's just, it's statement. And the fact that, God takes this chaos of this emptiness, chaotic, shapeless bit of earth and begins to shape it by his word. The third verse, and God said, Vayomer Elohim, and you get this gorgeous, and God said, and then everything changes. As soon as the word enters into the story, everything changes. Now, when we read the creation story, it's the word that comes out of the mouth of God that is transformational. That word, I think, God speaks 11 times in the creation story, which is, and every time he speaks, something dramatic happens and something changes and is transformed. Now, in the same way that Moses gives us the uncompromising introduction in Torah, John gives us an absolutely uncompromising introduction into his gospel. You're just left nowhere to go. He's not presenting an argument, as it were. He's presenting a fact, and he's simply setting this up and saying, actually, that word that was spoken, that word that shaped the shapelessness of the universe, that brought substance to the emptiness and order to the chaos, that word is now among us. And I think it's hard maybe for people who've been raised in the church or come to a place of faith, without having to make that journey, to understand how difficult that would be for a Jewish worldview, in terms of just hearing that as a shocking statement of fact within that. But John is uncompromising in his presentation of that, and wanting to connect the two ideas together, and making sure that we understand that the word that we're now looking at in the gospel was the word that was at work in the Genesis story, and the Word who shapes. So it is uncompromising. It is controversial. But again, John brilliantly echoes the creation story. In him was life, the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can't grasp it, understand it, or overcome it, whatever way you want to translate that. You've got that sort of sense that, my goodness, just as the light pierced creation in the beginning and started to bring order to the chaos, so now the one who spoke that light now has come as light himself to the world. And again, an idea he himself will pick up later in the gospel. So that's it for this episode. Now, we know there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you like this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated it, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing the podcast. If you'd like to support us, visit twotext.com. But that's all for now. So until next time, from David and I, it's goodbye.